Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Megan Bryan again, and this is my second lecture on the history of the vampire in folklore, literature, and film. So let's get right into it. So as discussed in the last lecture, the popularity of the vampire spread all over Europe due largely to its association with Lord Byron. The vampire's connection with Byron also manages to convey a legitimacy to a work, The Vampire, that perhaps otherwise would never have amounted to much more than the status of popular melodrama. James B. Twitchell here asserts that, quote, the male vampire certainly should have been a most attractive demon to the second generation of romantics, for here was the personification of a most peculiar kind of exiled man, eternally outcast yet dependent on others, a lover yet incapable of loving, a Superman yet a pathetic weakling, a Napoleon among men. Here was the Gothic Don Juan, Milton's Satan reborn, the romantic artist himself. He was, in fact, the psychic vampire whose needs of self-perpetuation depended on the destruction of others. To a considerable extent, the miscurrency is a tribute to this one man, Lord Byron. I think that's quite true. I also like to note here that Twitchell gets to the point that the vampire is a creature that needs to destroy others to perpetuate itself. So this will be something I'll contend with later in Dracula about how it's not possible for them to actually love anyone because their whole life is about murdering people to survive. And this portrait here of Lord Byron is an Albanian dress. And so again, there's that connection of Lord Byron with the East, the Levant, which is, of course, where the vampire originates. So the icon of Byron really attracted a massive following, and the vampire's association with the celebrity idol and cultural phenomenon like Byron aided in transcending its place as a footnote in poetry to the central subjects of works themselves. The vampire's emergence into the literary sphere is achieved both by its association with the member of elite society and melodramas designed to appeal to the masses. It's the marriage of these two elements that shoots the vampire into popular imagination during the long 19th century, culminating in its most famous incarnation, Count Dracula, in 1897. But from 1819, when The Vampire was published, until the end of the century, the vampire occupied a very unique space in 19th century literature. So the Gothic genre, which rose to prominence in the mid-18th century, had by the late 18th century made the horror elements of its text much more explicit. Think of the evolution of horror films from the 1940s and 50s, where violence is largely implied, versus the slasher movies of the 1970s and 80s with blood and gore all over the screen. And something similar happens with the Gothic genre there. From supernatural and menacing, the Gothic had become excessively explicit as the demand for more shocking literature increased. This was likely partially due to the horrors of the French Revolution, which was going on at the time, where explicit violence occurred on a daily basis, and thus desensitized the audiences of fiction into needing greater horrors for entertainment. Matthew Lewis's 1796 tale, The Monk, is probably the pinnacle of this trend. And as you can see from the title page here, the story promises an abundance of sex and violence, and basically spoils the whole story in this title page. And it's still a very uncomfortable read today, not for the faint-hearted. So go check that out if you've got a strong stomach. You see here it says The Monk, a Romance, the one in which it is depicted the wonderful adventures of Ambrosio, friar of the Order of Capuchin, who was diverted from the track of virtue by the artifices of a female demon, of course, that entered his monastery disguised as a novice, and after seducing him from his vow of celibacy, presented him with a branch of enchanted myrtle to obtain the person of the beautiful Antonia of Madrid, how he was discovered in her chamber by her mother, whom he murdered to keep his crime a secret, and the particulars of the means by which he caused the body of Antonia to be conveyed in a sleep to the dreary vaults of his own convent, where he accomplished his wicked machinations on the innocent virgin, whom he then assassinates with a dagger, presented him by his attendant fiend, who afterward betrays him to the judges of the Inquisition, in the dungeons of which he is confined and suffers torture, and how, to escape from thence, he assigns over his soul and body to the devil, who deceives him and inflicts most ignominious deaths. That's really a very big spoiler alert on that title page, because that's the whole story. And that's the 1818 edition of The Monk, and summarizes its lurid contents for the contemporary appetite. Now, the reaction to the popularity of these tales was mostly contempt from the literary establishment, and also a doubt that this could last long term, as we can see in the review by Samuel Taylor Coleridge here. He says, quote, the horrible and the preternatural have usually seized on the popular taste at the rise and decline of literature. Most powerful stimulants, they can never be required except by the torpor of an unawakened or the languor of an exhausted appetite. We trust, however, that satiety will banish what good sense should have prevented, and that wearied with fiends, incomprehensible characters, with shrieks, murders, and subterraneous dungeons, the public will learn by the multitude of the manufacturers with how little expensive thought or imagination this species of composition is manufactured. So he's hoping that's going to just die out naturally. And unfortunately, he's very mistaken about that. So the vampires we talked about in the last lecture was really the first story to successfully fuse the disparate elements of vampirism into a coherent literary genre. But there was, as you can see, no shortage of demand for tales of terror and supernatural creatures at the time of its publication, and indeed after. While the label of vampire was relatively uncommon in such stories, the creature had a fertile groundwork from which to emerge from the 1820s onward. Stories about murderers, ghosts, and supernatural entities populated the pages of popular fiction. Some of these stories include such ominous titles as The Buried Alive, Le Revenant, that's Buried Alive from 1821, Le Revenant is from 1827, The Spectre Smitten, 1831, and a tale that took full advantage of the new potential horrors of the operating room, Post-Mortem Recollections of a Medical Lecture from 1836. The authors of these stories utilized both superstition and modern scientific progress in order to shock their readers. The Buried Alive features a conscious protagonist believed to be dead, whose body is in danger of being dissected by anatomy students after some galvanic experiment is attempted. So again, that's the relation back to the Shelley and the Frankenstein connection over this rise in galvanism and the fear that you could actually bring the dead back to life. The concern of being buried alive and the treatment of corpses was one that preoccupied mid-century London in particular, largely due to its overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. The mid-19th century was a time of rapidly increasing urbanization. Between 1841 and 1851 alone, some 330,000 migrants flooded to London, representing a staggering 17% of London's total population. In the 1850s, a further 286,000 migrants arrived, and in the 1860s, 331,000. With increased population came overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and disease epidemics, resulting in mass deaths. And in a city of industry and overpopulation, the disposal of the human body after death proved extremely challenging. Coffins were stacked one on top of the other in 20-foot deep shafts, the topmost mere inches from the surface. Putrefying bodies were frequently disturbed, dismembered, or destroyed to make room for newcomers. Disinterred bones dropped by neglectful gravediggers lay scattered amidst the tombstones. Smashed coffins were sold to the poor for firewood. And clergymen and sextons turned a blind eye to the worst practices because burial fees formed a large proportion of their income. By the 1840s, London's overcrowded churchyards were not only seen as posing a logistical challenge, but damned as a source of miasma. Sanitarians quite mistakenly believed that the stench from poorly interred decaying bodies was poisoning the metropolis. This miasma was interpreted as a poison floating around the city, infecting its residents. The satirical magazine Punch personified the miasma in a poem entitled The Vampire No Superstition here from 1847. And you see there, the bloodshot moon glares on the close crowded graves through the foul mist that over the sepulchres waves. On the tombs where the city with people o'erspread in the midst of the living hath buried its dead. A glimmering vapor creeps over the ground. You may see whence it issues, you newly raised mound. Mark what spectre ascends in that horrible light. Lo, the vampire infection is rising tonight. The vampire, avoid him. His breath is the reek of the charnel, the poison of death. He has broken his prison of pestilent clay, and the grave yields him up on the living to prey. The vampire, behold where he flies, to the couch where his wife in her widowhood lies. Of her lost one, her husband, she dreams in her rest, whilst the vampire is fixing his fangs in her breast. The vampire, his infant child sleeps, to its innocent cradle he stealthily creeps, and his bite its pure cheek with a plague spot disdains, and corrupts his own blood in the little one's veins. The vampire, nor mercy nor ruth, saves his kindred and friends from his venomous tooth. He is bound to a task which he cannot evade. He is sent by a mandate which must be obeyed. The vampire, beneath a stern doom, on his terrible errand he breaks from the tomb. To work vengeance and woe is his mission of dread upon those mid the living who bury their dead. So you can see a lot there. You have this, again, this idea of the vampire, in this case, disease personified, attacking the family first, the wife and the child, and then, of course, its friends from its venomous tooth. And so, again, there's this close association between the vampire and epidemics of disease. except obviously in this case, it's a literal infection that's personified as a vampire. Now, one of the pluses in this increase in population was an increase in the demand for fiction. During this time, magazines assumed an unprecedented importance due largely to the increased population and mass education movement, which led to a new class of literate reading public hungry for stories. There were three categories of periodicals in the mid-19th century: daily newspapers devoted to politics, monthly magazines devoted to variety, amusement, and fiction, and reviews published every 3 months, which were somber, substantial, and highly respectable. You can see here William Hazlitt, who's a critic, says to be an Edinburgh reviewer is, I suspect, the highest rank in modern literary society. So again, this is quite an elite position. But in the less respectable periodical, the magazine is where the supernatural found a natural home. You can see here, this is Robert Morrison and Chris Baldick, who edited an anthology of Blackwood, which is a magazine. They said the magazines offered a broader and more sophisticated consideration of political events than the newspapers, and they possessed an immediacy and variety that the reviews could not match. They were the most exuberant and original of the periodicals, while their preoccupation with violence, scandal, and hysteria made them a natural outlet for terror fiction. And another element that made the magazine the most popular publisher of terror fiction at the time, compared to previous Gothic novels, was the shortened format of the tales. With a maximum length of about 10,000 words, rather than the longer volume novels of Anne Radcliffe or William Godwin, magazine stories required a more condensed account of terror and a quicker pace of suspense. It's a case of the magazine influencing style and output by the very nature of its format, which is very unique in the mid-century. Blackwood's magazine began running serials in the year 1820, specializing in what would popularly be known as sensation fiction. The vague, shadowy threats of Anne Radcliffe's Gothic genre are replaced by Blackwood's greater precision of description in scenes of terror and horror, reaching an almost scientific degree of accuracy. And it is this attention to detail that will carry on later vampire works. Even longer stories, such as Varney the Vampire, which we'll talk about later, are divided into smaller, self-contained plots that build and conclude within a single issue or two, sort of like a modern comic book. The comic continues on, but there's going to be a self-contained story within a few issues. But it's the thorough description of feeling and sensation that sets the magazine tales apart from others. And Blackwood, as I said, was probably one of the most popular magazines at the time. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a satirical parody called How to Write a Blackwood Article shortly after a story of his was rejected from Blackwood's in 1838. The account details a visit from an aspiring writer called Miss Zenobia to the Blackwood offices in Edinburgh, where the editor informs her about how to write a proper Blackwood's magazine. It says here, sensations are the great things after all. Should you ever be drowned or hung, be sure and make a note of your sensations. They will be worth to you 10 guineas a sheet. If you wish to write forcibly, Miss Zenobia, pay minute attention to the sensations. And he describes how we get these sensations. The first thing requisite is to get yourself into such a scrape as no one has ever got into before. The oven, for instance, that was a good hit. But if you have no oven or big bell at hand, and if you cannot conveniently tumble out of a balloon or be swallowed up in an earthquake or get stuck fast in a chimney, you will have to be contented with simply imagining some similar misadventure. I should prefer, however, that you have the actual fact to bear you out. Nothing so well assists the fancy as an experimental knowledge of the matter in hand. Here I assured him I had an excellent pair of garters and would go and hang myself forthwith. Good, he replied, do so, although hanging is somewhat hackneyed. Perhaps you might do better. However, my instructions will apply equally well to any variety of misadventure, and on your way home you may easily get knocked in the head or run over by an omnibus or bitten by a mad dog or drowned in a gutter. Now, this is obviously Poe having some fun with this idea that you have to sort of kill yourself and then you'll be able to write accurately about sensations. And later on the story, the woman is, in fact, she gets her sensations by being impaled on the Edinburgh clock, which falls on her. But he's, of course, being a bit bitter because his story was rejected by them. But it's interesting that if you read a lot of Poe, you understand that he's obsessed with these ideas of sensation, like Pit and the Pendulum is really a story with, there's not a lot of plot. It's just literally this guy lying between a pit and the pendulum and describing the sensation of mounting terror of this pendulum coming down. And so if you take it as he was being satirical at this point, you can also read a lot of his works as being satirical, which I think is an interesting idea. You know, people always take Poe very seriously as this kind of emo goth precursor. But it's interesting to think that he might have just been making fun of that all along, and they sort of become the god of that. Ironic. Now, Poe's choice of the author as Miss Zenobia is noteworthy. Stories which produce sensations were believed to be particularly effective on, and therefore dangerous to, women. A prevalent scientific theory in the mid-century was the closed body system, which is a theory detailing that human beings possess a finite amount of energy, which once wasted can never be restored. Theories espoused by Patrick Geddes and J. Arthur Thompson in the mid-19th century concluded that women lagged behind men evolutionarily, much as it was believed that primitive people lagged behind Europeans. Even as adults, it was believed women remained childlike in body and mind, never developing traits such as beards that distinguish men from boys. And the reason for women's arrested development was the need to preserve their fine energies for reproduction, and such energies shouldn't be wasted on frivolous thrills and shocks. And that's not only something that's silly to do, it's also dangerous to do. This rationale was the basis of a pervasive anxiety throughout the 19th and indeed earlier in the 18th century, which involved women readers succumbing to absorptive pleasure and becoming unfit for their social function of childbearing. This belief was illustrated in the 1797 article in the Monthly Mirror entitled Novel Reading a Cause of Female Depravity. You can see it here. This is actually the 1817 edition from La Belle Assembly. The anonymous author praises the publication for pleasantly combining moral excellence with elegant literature, in contrast to novels, which the author calls poison instilled into the blood. This anxiety manifested itself throughout the 19th century. Reading was damned because it was thought to damage a woman's nervous system and reproductive health. Medical authorities linked excessive, unsupervised reading to a host of female reproductive ailments. For example, early menstruation, painful menses, infertility, insanity, and even premature death. A woman's biological differences, they believed, her greater sensitivity and sensibility, made her more susceptible to the effects of a novel than men would be. Countless experts pronounce sensation novels, mysteries, and horror tales stimuli to avoid strenuously for physical well-being. And you can see here, those who first made novel reading an indispensable branch in forming the minds of young women have a great deal to answer for. Without this poison instilled, as it were, into the blood, females in ordinary life would never have been so much the slaves of vice. Yeah, so that's an argument sort of familiar in this day and age with things like violent video games and how, people shouldn't be exposed to them. But it's always been a concern that, immoral literature, immoral things would sort of somehow corrupt people, particularly women. But the view of sensation and its deadly effect was not limited to women, but also, of course, to children who are more vulnerable. And the concern for children's well-being when exposed to fiction, particularly what will be known as penny dreadful fiction, is a huge concern of contemporary writers during the mid-century. Penny dreadfuls, or penny bloods, were blamed for a rise of crime and violence among young people from their inception in the mid-century throughout the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. Penny dreadfuls can sort of loosely be defined as an expressive term for cheap publications, they cost a penny, hence the name penny dreadful, which depended more upon sensationalism than upon artistic or literary merit for success. And you can see here they're blamed for all sorts of evils. You have Bracebridge Hemming in 1861 saying another very fruitful scourge of early demoralization is to be looked for in the quantities of penny and halfpenny romances that are sold in town and country. One of the worst of the most recent ones is denominated Charlie Wagg, or the New Jack Sheppard, a history of the most successful thief in London. To say that these stories are not incentives to lust, theft, and crime of every description is to cherish a fallacy. Why should not the police, by act of parliament, be empowered to take cognizance of the shameful misuse of the art of printing? So that's your censorship right there. And then even as late as 1893, we have Alfred Harmsworth saying, the police court reports in the newspapers are not alone sufficient proof of the harm done by penny dreadfuls. It is an almost daily occurrence with magistrates to have before them boys who, having read a number of dreadfuls, followed the examples set forth in such publications, robbed their employers, bought revolvers with the proceeds, and finished by running away from home and installing themselves in the back streets as highwaymen. This and many other evils the penny dreadful is responsible for. It makes thieves of the coming generation and so helps fill our jails. Now, I don't think that ever happened. I suppose it might have, but it certainly wasn't the fault of penny dreadfuls. As again, you can see here the violent video game argument that we have so much today about these boys who can't tell the difference between fiction and reality. These mass shooters, are responsible because they've seen horror films or played violent video games like Doom. So it's always the same thing. Nothing really changes. But you can see in this instance, the term penny dreadful is used by contemporaries as a catch-all for any cheap work of fiction believed to produce a harmful effect upon the young. Same as violent video games and horror movies, as I've said. In this way, the penny dreadful label is similar to the sensation label of later decades, a pejorative, non-specific term for any cheap story involving graphic depictions of crime and violence. One of the most well-known penny bloods is The String of Pearls, or The Sailor's Gift here, published by Edward Lloyd in his magazine, The People's Periodical and Family Library in 1846. And I think that was one of the objections to the penny dreadfuls, is that it's a family library, but they're actually quite violent and gruesome. This one is just one of Lloyd's many magazines. His business had established itself by the 1840s as the informal center of the penny blood publishing industry. Lloyd had been alive to the potential market available to any publisher willing to provide the rapidly expanding audience of working class readers with even cheaper and more sensational reading material. Edward Lloyd was also an early plagiarist, publishing pirated and slightly edited versions of Charles Dickens's popular works, starting in 1836. Now, The String of Pearls here is more commonly known today as Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. The story was plagiarized in America in 1852, and the title changed to Sweeney Todd or the Ruffian Barber. The tale became so popular that as early as 1878, it had become widely accepted that Sweeney Todd was actually a historical person, which some people still believe today. The year after Sweeney Todd was published, the same magazine, Edward Lloyd's family periodical, published in 1845 the first chapter of the penny dreadful Varney the Vampire. Now, the writers of penny dreadfuls were often uncredited and frequently lost to time. Indeed, the authorship of Varney the Vampire or the Feast of Blood remains somewhat controversial. In 1963, a number of James Malcolm Rymer's scrapbooks and letters were unearthed, and this find established him as the primary author of Varney the Vampire. Rymer combined powerful melodrama with narrative skill learned from mainstream writers, including Charles Dickens, Anne Radcliffe, and Walter Scott. However, it is extremely likely that the story, judging from differences in styles and syntax and the character of Varney, had more than one author at any given time. Now, the story of Varney the Vampire lacks a linear concept of narrative, but rather contains episodic occurrences which are often inconsistent. And that's, again, like a sort of comic book. There'll be little runs that will conclude one narrative and then start another one. But if you want to compare it to something like Batman, Varney would be like if you wrote Batman sort of as he is now, the sort of grim, dark Frank Miller style, and then the next issue have him like the Adam West Batman. Varney's such an inconsistent character, and the tone of the story is so inconsistent. Sometimes it's a comedy, sometimes it's trying to be this insanely serious Shakespearean drama. It's a real hoot to read, but I don't recommend you do it because it's really terrible. And the reason, as I said, that it lacks linear concept of narrative and characterization is due to its nature as a serial, which was published over the course of 2 years, and it contains in total 232 chapters and nearly 667,000 words. It's a beast. Now, Varney in the story arrives in England on a night when the storm raged, hail, rain, wind. It was in truth a very awful night. So again, dark and stormy night. Varney appears outside the window of a young woman, clattering with nails, searching for an entrance. And you can see this here. The bed in that old chamber is occupied. A creature formed in all fashions of loveliness lies in a half sleep upon that ancient couch. A girl young and beautiful as a spring morning. So this is, again, you remember Ianthe from The Vampire, this innocent, beautiful, perfect, pure woman. A tall figure is standing on the ledge, immediately outside the long window, feeling for an entrance and clattering against the glass with its long nails that appear as if the growth of many years had been untouched. And again, that's something, if you think back to the vampire, the folkloric vampire accounts, you know, the nails will continue to grow. So Rymer knows his stuff in this instance. You'll see here, the figure turns half round, the light falls upon the face. It is perfectly white, perfectly bloodless. The eyes look like polished tin, the lips are drawn back, and the principal feature next to those dreadful eyes is the teeth. The fearful-looking teeth projecting like those of some wild animal, hideously, glaringly white and fang-like. It approaches the bed with a strange, gliding movement, but her eyes of the woman are fascinated. The glance of a serpent could not have produced a greater effect upon her than the fixed gaze of those awful, metallic-looking eyes that were bent on her face. Crouching down so that the gigantic height was lost and the horrible, protruding white face was the most prominent object, came on the figure. Her bosom heaves and her limbs tremble, yet she cannot withdraw her eyes from that marble-looking face. He holds her with his glittering eye. And then you have the glassy, horrible eyes of the figure ran over that angelic form with a hideous satisfaction, horrible profanation. He drags her head to the bed's edge. He forces it back by the long hair still entwined in his grasp. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth. A gush of blood and a hideous sucking noise follows. The girl has swooned, and the vampire is at his hideous repast. So you can see here, there's similarities to Ruthven. Varney's face described as perfectly white, similar to Ruthven's deadly hue of face. So you've got that pale thing going on there. And as it says, one of his principal features is the fearful looking teeth. This is a departure from Polidori. He doesn't actually mention Ruthven's teeth at all. So this is the first time really that the teeth are described as fang-like. Both Polidori and Reimer do, however, focus on the eyes of their vampires and their powers of fascination. You have the glance of a serpent, the hypnotic gaze, and then you have this metallic gaze that's just similar to Ruthven's dead gray eye that fell upon the cheek with a leaden ray. So far, it's so similar to Ruthven there. But Varney the vampire adds a new dimension to the vampire, humanity. Varney is a monster with human feeling, weaknesses, and regrets, which is seen frequently in modern adaptations of the vampire, but was unprecedented in its time. Varney, in his own words, has been among the dead and yet is mortal. The vampire in this instance is a creature who has returned to life from the dead, but who can still be killed and wounded by mortal means, as well as feeling mortal feelings. Varney expresses self-loathing of his condition, and the story adds a new layer to the vampire as a being who can be saved through love. And you can see this here. Never yet in all my long career, a career extending over centuries of time, never yet have I felt the soft sensation of human pity till I looked on thee, exquisite piece of excellence. Even at the moment when the reviving fluid was from the gushing fountain of your veins was warming at my heart, I pitied and I loved you. Oh, Flora, even I can now feel the pang of being what I am. I am one who has witnessed time's mutation on man and his works, and I have pitied neither. I have seen the fall of empires and sighed not that high-reached ambition was toppled to the dust. I have seen the grave close over the young and beautiful, those whom I have doomed by my insatiable thirst for human blood to death, long ere the usual span of life was past, but I never loved till now. Can such a being as you, said Flora, be susceptible of such an earthly passion? And wherefore not? Love is either too much of heaven or too much of earth to find a home with thee. And I think that's a brilliant line. Love is a heavenly thing and also an earthly thing, but it's certainly not something of hell, which is what she implies that Varney is. And again, you have this continued demonic association with the vampire in the character of Varney. He is this damned demonic monster. But he says here, it is a condition with my hateful race that if we can find one human heart to love us, we are free. If in the face of heaven you will consent to be mine, you will snatch me from a continuance of my frightful doom. And for your pure sake and on your merits shall I yet know heavenly happiness. Will you be mine? No, no, shrieked Flora, never. Enough, said Varney. I am answered. It was a bad proposal. I am a vampire still. I love that line. It was a bad proposal. I'm a vampire still. Then am I doomed yet, perhaps for many a cycle of years, to spread misery and desolation around me. And yet I love you with a feeling which has in it more of gratefulness and unselfishness than ever yet found a home within my breast. I would fain have you, although you cannot save me. Believe me, that if my victims, those whom my insatiable thirst for blood make wretched, suffer much, I, the vampire, am not without my moments of unutterable agony. So this is sort of like a Twilight vampire, he needs this true love, and it's sort of like a fairy tale as well. Like if you find your true love, the curse will be broken, the spell will be broken by true love's kiss. But again, he has the sort of self-loathing, the self-hatred, which is really unprecedented and won't be seen in the more famous vampires. As I said, vampirism in Varney the Vampire is similar to a temporary spell that can be broken through love rather than a permanent affliction, which is what we usually think of it as. And Varney, like Ruthven, has an eye for beautiful young women, but while the story opens with the account of him menacing the attractive Flora Bannerworth in order to drink her blood, his interactions with other women in the story are really much less sinister. There's even a section where a young woman and her mother try to entrap him into marriage to take advantage of his wealth and position. Varney in the story is both predator and victim of unfortunate circumstance. And of course, Varney is another aristocratic vampire. His full title is Sir Francis Varney, believed to be a baronet like Lord Byron. So there's that Byron association again. And also I mentioned in the last lecture that he encounters the Count Polidori. And so again, that's a reference to Reimer knowing his stuff and having read the vampire story. And it's interesting as well that Varney doesn't really seem to want blood much. He seems to really be in pursuit of money. He wants Bannerworth Hall, where Flora lives. He says, I will have that, even though I have to wade through blood to get it. And so he seems to really be obsessed more with wealth and power and property than actually getting victims. That's interesting. Again, if you want to read this as a sort of capitalist creature, that he literally becomes this kind of capitalist creature with this never-ending lust for money rather than blood. I think it's a really interesting idea. And at the end of the very long story, Varney confesses his crimes to a clergyman before electing to end his own life by throwing himself into Mount Vesuvius. He had died at many points throughout the serial, including one where he's hanged and his body is taken down for an anatomist to use as an galvanic experiment. So again, there's that connection to Shelley and Frankenstein there. Now, he's died at many points throughout the serial, but due to the lack of a body, presumably could not return again this time. Lack of body is the final solution for vampires, as we saw from the folklore, where you have to cut them up or burn them. Varney claims to have lived for centuries, although a deal with the devil is never explicitly stated. And as I said, Flora says that he's sort of a hellish creature. And then when he elects to commit suicide, he's further exiling himself from Christian society by damning himself forever, which is what happens to suicides. They also become vampires, ironically, so maybe he could have just come back later. And it's a confessional, as I said at the end, which echoes Byron's The Giaour. That was also a confessional poem. So again, Reimer's done his research. He knows his vampires. Penny Dreadfuls were printed well into the 1860s and 70s, but the rise of the sensation novel from the 1860s onwards eclipsed penny fiction in terms of popularity, and then became the dominant medium for supernatural tales. There will always be labels applied to dismissed works, and if Penny Dreadful didn't do it, sensation would. It became a very popular label to throw around in the mid-century. It is the ability to write subjects suitable for penny fiction, but in a legitimate way, that informs the debate around sensation fiction in the 1850s and 60s. Charles Dickens was accused many times of being a sensationalist, and he wrote in All the Year Round the following: if anyone writes a novel, a play, or a poem which relates anything out of the ordinary experiences of the most ordinary people, some tragedy of love or revenge, some strange and not impossible combination of events, or some romance of guilt and misery, he is straightway met with a loud exclamation of sensational. This foolish word has become the orthodox stone for flinging at any heretic author who is bold enough to think that life has its tremendous passes of anguish and crime, as well as its little joys and little sorrows, its strange adventures and vicissitudes, as well as its daily progresses from Brixton to the Bank, and who holds that the more vividly colored part of the grouping is as legitimate a subject for artistic treatment as the more drab-hued section. But the anti-sensational critic will tell you that if you write a novel or a play that is fit to be read by anyone with tastes superior to those of a butcher boy, you must confine yourself strictly to the common events of common lives, have nothing whatever to say to any of the extremes of passion or of action, leave murder to the penny papers, be ignorant of suicide, have no idea that there are dark shadows in the world, and shun a mystery as you would the measles. Life itself is similarly sensational in many of its aspects, and nature is similarly sensational in many of her forms, and art is always sensational when it is tragic. So as usual, Dickens sort of says it best and silences his critics. But there was this real tension during the mid-century between what we'd later call realism. George Eliot, the novelist, doesn't call it realism at the time, but she does talk about how you have to have a true study of nature, and that's the only avenue for having legitimate fiction. But what distinguishes the sensation genre as it appeared in its prime during the 1860s is the violent yoking of romance and realism, traditionally the two contradictory modes of literary perception. And that's what Dickens is saying here, that you can have both. You can have a realistic novel that yet contains aspects of sensation, and that doesn't make it a sensational novel. But the term sensation novel was originally applied disparagingly to a broad range of crime, mystery, and horror novels written in the early 1860s. The label sensation is American in origin and first appeared in November of 1861. Indeed, America is largely blamed for the rise of the popularity of sensation fiction in the 1860s due to the American Civil War. According To novelist Margaret Oliphant, quote, "On the other side of the Atlantic, a race blasé and lost in universal ennui has bethought itself of the grand expedient for procuring a new sensation, war. And albeit we follow at a humble distance, we too begin to feel the need of a supply of new shocks and wonders." So like the French Revolution in the late 18th century, the Civil War in the mid-century is blamed for increasing the appetite for these horrors. Writer Henry Mansell also blames the periodicals, circulating libraries, and newly formed railway bookstalls for what he deems, quote, "the widespread corruption of which sensation novels are both the effect and the cause, called into existence to supply the cravings of a diseased appetite and contributing themselves to foster the disease and to stimulate the want which they supply. This kind of literature, according to Mansell, is allegedly unwholesome. Corruption and disease implied that reading such works will lead to not only a moral decay, but a physical decay as well. The effect on the reader is, according to Mansell, to, quote, to conjure up a corporeal rather than a cerebral response. The railway bookstalls are to blame because the exigencies of railway traveling do not allow much time for examining the merits of a book before purchasing, and people are satisfied with the promise of temporary excitement to relieve the dullness of a journey. And he talks about like the lending libraries are to blame, and these it's again, there's sort of class snobbery here, that these poor, uneducated, working class people would want these silly stories. Why can't they read something more wholesome? Like Penny Dreadful, sensation novels were believed to corrupt the weak-willed and weak-minded, in this case, women. And it is in this environment during the mid-century when the female vampire will first come into being. Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu was the first story in English to feature a female vampire as the central character. Between its publication in 1872 and the publication of Dracula in 1897, about 2/3 of the 15 vampire stories which were published in this quarter of a century featured the female vampire. So Sheridan Le Fanu's creation was clearly an influential one. Like Dickens, Le Fanu rejected the label of a sensation author. In Le Fanu's introduction to Uncle Silas in 1864, he condemns this label, comparing his works to the works of Sir Walter Scott. He says here, "May the author be permitted a few words also of remonstrance against the promiscuous application of the term sensation. No one, it is assumed, would describe Sir Walter Scott's romances as sensation novels. Yet in that marvelous series, there is not a single tale in which death, crime, and in some form mystery have not a place." And like Dickens, he says, the author trusts that the press, to whose masterly criticism and generous encouragement he and other humble laborers in the art owe so much, will insist upon the limitation of that degrading term, sensation, to the peculiar type of fiction which it was originally intended to indicate, and prevent, as they may, its being made to include the legitimate school of tragic English romance, which has been ennobled and in the great measure founded by the genius of Sir Walter Scott. So he's appealing to authors like Sir Walter Scott to give legitimacy to his own forays into what would be described as sensational. Le Fanu's Irish background informed his work. He was raised in Limerick, where his father was a Protestant rector and comparatively well off, as opposed to the majority Catholic and majority destitute Irish population at the time. While a native of Ireland, Le Fanu's circumstances and upbringing, as well as his religion, set him apart from its regular citizens, and his sense of Irish identity must have been fairly complicated. Despite this, his work reflects a love of Irish culture and folklore similar to Bram Stoker, another displaced Irishman, who was also exposed to the fantastical and supernatural aspects of Irish legends as a boy. Both marginalized Irish Protestants living in England but regretting Ireland, stemming from families with strong clerical and professional colorations, whose occult preoccupation surely mirrors a sense of displacement and a loss of social and psychological integration. Now, pop psychology aside, Le Fanu's keen interest in the occult and supernatural accounts for the many references in Carmilla to the oral history of the vampire discussed in the first lecture. Carmilla's village has been destroyed by her curse, echoing the belief that the vampire destroyed its own family and village first. She admits that she is the last of her family, although the narrator of the story, Laura, seems to be descended from her somehow, and Carmilla is irresistibly compelled to destroy her because of that. There is little about Le Fanu's Carmilla that resembles Polidori's Ruthven, however. Carmilla, though retaining the title of nobility, is, as she goes, her real name is Lady Mircalla, Countess of Karnstein. But she's not an aloof aristocratic seducer, but rather a passionate young woman who has difficulty controlling her feelings. Laura describes her as engaging as opposed to Ruthven's aloofness, and she shows affection for Laura, giving her trembling embraces and soft kisses, as opposed to Ruthven's harsh treatment of his victims. Le Fanu's decision to return to folkloric roots suggests a desire to legitimize the vampire by returning it to its historical context, as Walter Scott did in his romances. Like Varney, Carmilla is both the victimizer and victim. Carmilla feels a morbid, possessive, jealous love, similar to Varney in her genuine passion and emotion. And you'll see here, I live in your warm life, and you shall die sweetly into mine. Die sweetly, die into mine. I cannot help it. As I draw near to you, you in your turn will draw near to others and learn the rapture of that cruelty, which yet is love. So for a while, seek to know no more of me and mine, but trust me with all your loving spirit. And when she had spoken such a rhapsody, she would press me more closely in her trembling embrace, and her lips and soft kisses gently glow upon my cheek. Sometimes, after an hour of apathy, my strange and beautiful companion would take my hand and hold it with a fond pressure, renewed again and again, blushing softly, gazing in my face with languid and burning eyes, and breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with the tumultuous respiration. It was like the ardor of a lover. It embarrassed me. It was hateful and yet overpowering, and with gloating eyes she drew me to her, and her hot lips traveled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper almost in sobs, "You are mine, you shall be mine, you and I are one forever." Modern readers interpret Carmilla as the first lesbian vampire story because of this, as you can see, rather arduous romance between two women. The subject of lesbianism in the mid-19th century was complex. While male homosexuality was outlawed and met with strong punishments, female homosexuality was, even as late as 1886, believed to be non-existent. Max Nordau claims in his book Paradoxes, originally published in 1886, that, quote, the sight or the idea of a person of her own sex has no power to excite a woman's sex center to any form of activity, and hence man must be her ideal of beauty. So contemporary readers of Carmilla could plausibly not notice the romantic relationship between the two characters, or rather read it as a kind of transgression that only exists in a sensational supernatural story. Throughout the story, Laura's free will is called into question. Carmilla appears to have a hypnotic power over Laura, as you can see here. Now, the truth is, I felt rather unaccountably towards the beautiful stranger. I did feel, as she said, drawn towards her, but there was also something of repulsion. In this ambiguous feeling, however, the sense of attraction immensely prevailed. She interested and won me. She was so beautiful and so indescribably engaging. And this sort of ambiguous feeling of attraction and repulsion is going to be seen a lot, particularly in Dracula, but also in much later vampire works. You're both attracted and repelled by them. Carmilla's power towards her victims is hypnotic, which again will be retained by the vampire throughout the century. You saw that a bit with Ruthven about the leaden eye, and same with Varney. And again here, from these foolish embraces, which were not of very frequent occurrence, I used to wish to extricate myself, but my energies seemed to fail me. Her murmured words sounded like a lullaby in my ear and soothed my resistance into a trance from which I only seemed to recover myself when she withdrew her arms. So unlike Varney and Ruthven, it's not her eyes that seem to hypnotize, it's her actual embrace. If you know anything about the idea of hypnotism in the early centuries, late 18th century, early 19th century, mesmerism was believed to be a way you could hypnotize people, and mesmerism was made by touching people. It only worked if you laid hands on the person, but then in later centuries, hypnotism is believed to work without touching, that you can somehow hypnotize through words, through eyes. And so this is sort of might be a callback to an early mesmerism idea rather than a hypnotic idea. And unlike both Ruthven and Varney, Carmilla in her vampiric assaults on her victims does not retain her human appearance. And maybe this is a way of getting around this idea of a romance between women. She turns into this cat. I soon saw that it was a sooty black animal that resembled a monstrous cat. It appeared to me about 4 or 5 feet long, for it measured fully the length of the hearthrug as it passed over it, and it continued toing and froing with the lithe, sinister restlessness of a beast in a cage. I could not cry out, although, as you may suppose, I was terrified. Its pace was growing faster, and the room rapidly darker and darker, and at length so dark that I could no longer see anything of it but its eyes. I felt it spring lightly on the bed. The 2 broad eyes approached my face, and suddenly I felt a stinging pain, as if 2 large needles darted and entered to a part deep into my breast. I waked with a scream. The room was lighted by the candle that burnt there all through the night, and I saw a female figure standing at the foot of the bed. So by making the vampire take on an animal form in order to pierce Laura's breast, Le Fanu avoids the overt act of transgression that a woman biting another woman's breast would be. So, and he's one of the first authors to associate the direct act of vampirism with an animal, and this ability to transform into an animal is going to be seen later in Dracula and all modern literature. They have them transforming into bats and wolves and things like that, and that comes from this. Carmilla blurs the boundaries of time and the boundaries of gender. She's a female creature with the ability to penetrate another female, and she appears to be solely attracted to the feminine. The tone throughout the story is uneasy, as if both the narrator and therefore the reader are unsure of the nature of Laura and Carmilla's relationship and unsure of both their feelings towards it. Laura admits at the end of the story that she fancies that she heard the light step of Carmilla at the drawing room door in an almost wishful fashion. Another striking aspect of Le Fanu's Carmilla is the power of the church and Christianity against the vampire. This aspect was not greatly focused on in earlier vampire literature works, although you saw that Flora accuses Varney of being hellish, and Ruthven is described as demonical, but there's really nothing, there's no encounter that they have with the church or with the cross or anything that's going to be later so associated with vampires. But I think that one of the reasons Le Fanu might have chosen to focus on that is that religion, of course, leads legitimacy to the work where other supernatural elements might not. And this is, there's a funeral procession for a girl that Carmilla is actually murdered. And she says, "You pierce my ears," said Carmilla almost angrily, and stopping her ears with her tiny fingers. "Besides, how can you tell that your religion and mine are the same? Your forms wound me, and I hate funerals. What a fuss! Why, you must die, everyone must die, and all are happier when they do. Well, her funeral is over, I hope, and her hymn sung, and our ears shan't be tortured with that discord and jargon. It has made me nervous." Her face underwent a change that alarmed and even terrified me for a moment. It darkened and became horribly livid. Her teeth and hands were clenched, and she frowned and compressed her lips while she stared down upon the ground at her feet and trembled all over with a continued shudder, as irrepressible as ague. All her energies seemed strained to suppress a fit, with which she was then breathlessly tugging, and at length a low convulsive cry of suffering broke from her, and gradually the hysteria subsided. "There, that comes of strangling people with him," she said at last. Hold me still, it is passing away." So, if you know modern vampire things, if you make like a cross with the vampire, it kind of hisses and runs away. So that seems to be the precursor to what's happening here. And this thing that she says about everyone must die and all are happier when they do, I think that's very interesting. That implies that she's sort of happier now as a living dead person than she was as in lives. That's very interesting. The sound of hymns gives Carmilla her fits, and she speaks of feeling strangled by the noise. It repels her just as the crucifix and the sacred wafer repel Dracula. And she also appears terrifying to Laura when she's faced with Christianity. Perhaps the hymn affects her because it is a reminder of her ultimate death, which she cannot escape. It's also a possibility that her anger is more a product of her guilt, since the girl in the funeral has died because of her. And her attitude towards religion is also strangely more complex than any vampire before or since. Rather than completely repelling her, she also debates it with her host. And you can see in the first quote, she talks about, "How do you know your religion and mine are the same?" Which is interesting. "All this," said my father, "is strictly referable to natural causes. These poor people infect one another with their superstitions, and so repeat in imagination the images of terror that have infested their neighbors." And that's sort of interesting if you think back to de Tournefort believing that vampirism is just a mass hysteria. "We are in God's hands. Nothing can happen without his permission, and all will end well for those who love him. He is our faithful creator. He has made us all and will take care of us." "Creator, nature," said Carmilla, in answer to my gentle father. "And this disease that invades the country is natural. Nature, all things proceed from nature, don't they? All things in the heaven, in the earth, and under the earth act and live as nature ordains? I think so." And I think that's really interesting that she believes that her existence is natural. But also, like the folkloric vampires, you can see she brings plagues and diseases with her. But she is also firm in her belief that her existence and all that it entails is in fact natural. Her plagues and her presence are not, in her mind, supernatural. They come from nature, as all things do. Carmilla's belief in her natural affliction and her questioning of the existence of God, and how do you know your religion is mine is the same, echoes the 19th century crisis of faith. The publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 changed scientific and religious discussion by challenging the time of the biblical creation and the boundary between human and animal. Carmilla's transformation into a cat-like creature also blurs the boundaries between the human and the animal, making this aspect of the vampire particularly relevant at this point in time. Darwin's theory of evolution also brought into question the Christian doctrine of a creator God. Darwin's Descent of Man was published in 1871, the year before Carmilla, and it applied the theory of evolution to human evolution in contradiction of biblical teaching. Now, Carmilla's demise evokes a sense of pity in the reader. You can see from the text that Lefanu has done his research into vampires, as the destruction of the vampire echoes the folkloric accounts provided in the previous lecture. The grave of the Countess Mircalla was open, and the general and my father recognized each his perfidious and beautiful guest in the face now disclosed to view. The features, though 150 years had passed since her funeral, were tinted with the warmth of life. Her eyes were open, no cadaverous smell exhaled from the coffin. The two medical men, one officially present, the other on the part of the promoter of the inquiry, attested the two medical men, one officially present, the other on the part of the promoter of the inquiry, attested the marvelous fact that there was a faint but appreciable respiration and a corresponding action of the heart. The limbs were perfectly flexible, the flesh elastic, and the leaden coffin floated with blood, in which, to a depth of 7 inches, the body lay immersed. So I think that's Arnold Powell, where they talk about there's no smell of the body, and then of course the limbs and the fresh bloods everywhere, and the limbs are flexible and pliable, as you saw with the other ones. And it says here, then were all the admitted signs and proofs of vampirism. The body, therefore, in accordance with the ancient practice, was raised, and a sharp stake driven through the heart of the vampire, who uttered a piercing shriek at the moment, in all respects such as might escape from a living person in the last agony. Then the head was struck off, and a torrent of blood flowed from the severed neck. The body and head was next placed on a pile of wood and reduced to ashes, which were thrown upon the river and borne away. And that territory has never since been plagued by the visits of a vampire. And I think he's definitely read Arnold Powell there. About the cry escaping from the vampire and then burying the body and throwing the ashes in the river. I think that's clearly he's read that. And this is where he differs from the folkloric accounts. It says, I may mention in passing the deadly pallor attributed to that sort of revenants is a mere melodramatic fiction. They present in the grave, and when they show themselves in human society, the appearance of healthy life. When disclosed to light in their coffins, they exhibit all the symptoms that are enumerated as those which prove the vampire life of the long dead Countess Karnstein. So he talks about they don't have to be pale, which again is an interesting take on it. It says here how they escape from their graves and return to them for certain hours every day without displacing the clay or leaving any trace of disturbance in the state of the coffin or the cerements has always been admitted to be utterly inexplicable. The amphibious existence of the vampire is sustained by daily renewed slumber in the grave. Its horrible lust for living blood supplies the vigor of its waking existence. The vampire is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence resembling the passion of love by particular persons. In pursuit of these, it will exercise inexhaustible patience and stratagem, for access to a particular object may be obstructed in 100 ways. It will never desist until it has satiated its passion and drained the very life of its coveted victim. But it will in these cases husband and protract its murderous enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and heighten it by the gradual approaches of an artful courtship. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. In ordinary ones, it goes direct to its object, overpowers with violence, and strangles and exhausts often at a single feast. So it's interesting there. It's this blending of Varney and Ruthven. It can be gentle and artful and looking for compassion when there's an object, so it's sort of its true love idea. But also it can just be a monster that just kills people for fun. And I think that's fascinating that you've got both there. And then it says, assume it's starting a territory perfectly free from that pest vampirism. How does it begin and how does it multiply itself? I will tell you, a person more or less wicked puts an end to himself. A suicide, under certain circumstances, becomes a vampire. That specter visits living people in their slumbers. They die, and almost invariably in the grave develop into vampires. This happened in the case of the beautiful Mircalla, who is haunted by one of those demons. The vampire and its expulsion from its amphibious existence is projected into a far more horrible life. And so again, he's done his research. He talks about these people kind of deserve to become vampires. A wicked person or a suicide becomes a vampire. But unlike the later victims of vampires and Dracula, and indeed Dracula himself, who is described as looking peaceful after death, Carmilla's fate is not nearly so pleasant. Whether this fate is, and that's the projected into a far more horrible life. Whether this fate is the punishment for Carmilla's vampire existence, for her transgression in questioning the existence of God, or for her unconventional sexuality is left ambiguous. The text, like many of Le Fanu's stories, leaves the reader with unresolved questions and a feeling of something left unsaid. The sympathy for the vampire in Carmilla and Varney cannot be found in the later novel Dracula. Despite several cinematic interpretations to the contrary, the title character in Dracula feels no guilt for his actions, nor love for any creature except himself. Stoker returns the vampire to being an unfeeling monster, having more in common with the villains of sensation novels. This changing attitude toward the vampire figure suggests a changing attitude toward the foreign and the unknown as the century neared its end. The foreign has always been an association of the vampire since the creature appeared in English literature. As you can see with Ruthven in the Levant, these are foreign sort of menaces that menace England. But towards the end of the century, the fear of the foreign was renewed in the still unsolved Jack the Ripper murders in the autumn of 1888. The murders took place in Whitechapel, a district of East London that was home to a large immigrant population, and the first suspects in the hunt for the Ripper's identity were foreign, largely Russian immigrants and Polish Jews. As the murders continued throughout September and October of 1888, several newspapers began comparing the Ripper to a vampire. The Daily Telegraph gave its opinion of the Ripper murders as being the product of men who are similar to monsters and who should be dispatched just as readily. It says there are natures mad only in being immeasurably bad, beings who look like men but are rather demons, vampires, of whom society has the right to be quickly rid without too much attention to the theories of mental experts. The vampire in this case is a creature worthy only of a swift death and no sympathy, unlike Varney or Carmilla. The newspaper equates people who are insane with vampires and believes, that's what he says, you don't want theories of mental experts about why people act the way they do, and believes that it is best in the best interest of society to destroy them without interference from mental experts. The association between insanity and vampires is made explicit in Bram Stoker's Dracula, wherein Dracula's insane servant Renfield aids him in terrorizing Mina. The implication is that the insane, if not monsters themselves, as the Telegraph suggests, are nevertheless allied with them. And the East London Advertiser wrote, it is so impossible to account on any ordinary hypothesis for these revolting acts of blood that the mind turns, as it were, instinctively to some theory of occult force, and the mists of the Dark Ages rise before the imagination. Ghouls, vampires, bloodsuckers, and all the ghastly array of fables which have been accumulated throughout the course of centuries take form and seize hold of the excited fancy. You can see here the writer treats ghouls, vampires, and bloodsuckers as three separate creatures, indicating that by 1888, the vampire had developed into a distinct figure in the public consciousness. The Ripper murders increased contemporary fears of the insane and the immigrant in the early 1890s. And this is a cartoon by Punch, which personifies the Ripper as social destitution and neglect. And this is an illustration in Punch in 1888 by John Tenniel, who, interestingly enough, illustrated Alice in Wonderland, if you've read that. As I said, the fears of the foreign and the insane were increased in the early 1890s during the time when Stoker was creating his vampire. And in fact, one of Dracula's addresses in which he had his boxes of earth was 197 Chickson Street, Mile End New Town in Whitechapel, which is the district where the Ripper murdered people. And the next lecture focuses primarily on Dracula, the book and its history and its many interpretations, and on how these and other themes come together to create what for many, and certainly for me, is the definitive vampire. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good day. See you next time. Bye.